Okay, we'll start the webinar. Good evening, everybody. I'm Gaurav, Marketing Head from Sonoscape India. On behalf of Sonoscape, I welcome all of you to today's webinar. Today's webinar is on practical approach to fetal brain vertigomegaly. And to conduct this webinar, we have a renowned faculty speaker, Dr. Nitin Chaubal sir, with us. Sir is a renowned teacher, guru, and a celebrated figure in the field of ultrasound imaging. Sir is having several national and international awards in his credit. He has been training radiologists from over India and abroad. His ultrasound clinic in Mumbai is recognized as a center of educational excellence, with innumerable workshops in ultrasound and color Dopplers are conducted routinely. Sir has been faculty speaker in many of the national and international conferences also. On behalf of Sonoscape, sir, I'd like to thank you for your continuous support for Sonoscape, and thank you for again taking out your precious time from your busy schedule for this webinar. As already many doctors has joined, and there are many more which are joining, so I'll just take few minutes of you to share a product video of Sonoscape premium segment Color Doppler S60, which is based on artificial intelligence platform. So I'll just run a small video for all of you. As you must have observed in the video, that artificial intelligence is saving a lot of your time and provides quick solutions with accuracy more than 95%. Our Multiple range of products are based on shared services platform where you can perform all kind of applications very easily. And we have a wide range of transducers also available to cater different kinds of application. So without taking much time, I'd like to hand over the session to Dr. Nitin Chaubal, sir. Thank you so much. Over to you, sir.
You'll have to allow me to share the screen, Gaurav.
Yes, sir. I have done that, sir. You can share now.
Can you see the screen?
No, sir. Can you do it again?
One second.
So on the bottom of your screen, it will be coming, sir. Share screen option.
I can't see it now. What happened? One second. Okay.
Yes, sir. Now it has come.
Okay, that's fine.
Yes, sir.
I'm audible?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. So good evening, all of you, and thanks to Sonoscape for arranging this webinar. Uh, uh, but we begin this webinar on a very sad note. This is because one of our very close colleagues in the radiology field, Dr. Subhash Ramani, who was a very senior radiologist, passed away this morning due to a cardiac problem. Subhash, for me, it's a personal loss because Subhash was my childhood friend. We were in the same school, almost from primary school or KG. We were in the same college after the school in St. Xavier's, and we were in the same college for our undergraduates in the Grand Medical College. So for me, and we were constantly in touch with him except for the last few days when he was not well. So it's a big loss for the country because he was one of the pioneers for mammography in the country. He was one of the persons who promoted mammography all over the country. He went for lectures in the country, outside the country. And in fact, he was instrumental in starting our own mammography program. So, and when it came to mammography, he was usually full of enthusiasm. When we had difficulty, we used to contact him. So it's a very big loss for the entire nation, I would say, and for the radiology fraternity. May his soul rest in peace. So what I'm going to do is make a look at ventriculomegaly, which is a very common problem in day-to-day practice, and how to approach it in a very practical way. So the idea is not to talk big things about CNS malformations, etc., but the idea is to give, to put in a very short way how to approach this particular problem of ventriculomegaly, which is one of the most common problems we see in fetal CNS system. So what we're going to do basically is look at some basic sections and how we pick up ventriculomegaly. Most important, we look at how to measure the lateral ventricle because just like an NT scan, we have to have certain guidelines which we need to follow. We will define ventriculomegaly and how to grade it. What do we do after diagnosing ventriculomegaly? What are the investigations we need to do? How to follow up these patients? What sort of a counseling we should offer? What is the prognosis and what is the outcome? And at the end, we'll also look at some frequently asked questions which come to our mind in day-to-day practice. But if there are any questions from the audience, you are able to ask them. So when we look at a fetal brain, these are the three common sections which we always take. One is, of course, the transventricular plane, the transcerebellar plane, and the transthalamic plane. So these are the standard planes which we have been taking for years. And usually in the transventricular plane, we realize that there is something wrong with the ventricles. There are two views which nowadays...
So sorry to interrupt. Sorry to interrupt. Can you just speak a bit louder? Voice is not coming properly, sir, please. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Is it better now, Gaurav?
Definitely, sir. Yes, okay, now great. Better.
I think the mic was a little away. Okay. I'm very sorry about this. Yeah. So we basically start with three common sections. One is the transventricular plane, then we look at the ventricles, the transcerebellar plane, and the transthalamic. But we now also include two important planes in our routine practice when we do a targeted scan. One is looking at the anterior complex. So in our center, and I think most of the centers, this has now become a compulsory section where we look at the cavum, septum, pellucidum, and the two horns of the frontal horn on either side, which are usually comma shaped. So this is a very must section nowadays, because if you pick up something wrong in the cavum, septum, pellucidum, then automatically it's a whistleblower towards anomalies like corpus callosum. We also include in all our patients sagittal, mid-sagittal plane, where we look at corpus callosum and sagittal. So besides the three common planes, these are the two planes which we have added to our list of compulsory planes, and we do it at all gestations because it gives us a lot of options. The moment we feel that something is wrong in these basic planes, then we change our exam to what is known as an extended neurosonogram. And in an extended neurosonogram, we take a series of coronal sections and three sagittal planes. Now, depending upon the fetal position, we might do this transabdominally if it's a breech and the head is on the top, or we might do it transvaginally if the head is down. If the head is down and we are able to do transvaginal scan, then of course we get much better information. But that depends on the fetal position and not on us. So in the coronal plane, we have four planes: the transfrontal, the transcaudate, transthalamic, and transcerebellar. Just to sort of revise, that's a transcaudate plane with the genu of the corpus callosum seen. That's a transthalamic plane with the thalamus seen there and the third ventricle, and the transcerebellar plane, which is a posterior. And in a sagittal, we take three planes. One is, of course, the mid-sagittal plane, where we look at the corpus callosum and the vermis, and a parasagittal plane, where we look at the lateral ventricle. So parasagittal planes again can be very important when you have a. So as we said that if the fetal head is down, then there is nothing like a transvaginal sonography. But of course, it depends on the position of the head. Even in a transvaginal scan, sometimes it is difficult if you are not able to hit the anterior fontanelle. So that depends on your lap. You might have to change the position of the fetus. You might have to press from the top. So it all depends. But if you're able to do a transvaginal scan, then the information you get is much better. Just for an example, this is a case which I will be referring to. This is done yesterday, but this is a case of mild ventriculomegaly which we are following up, and I'll come to some points a little later. But this just shows how well we see the lateral ventricles, the cavum septum, and the corpus callosum, where there was a slight problem. So as Gaurav said, these are the days of artificial intelligence, and most of the things which I said about extended neurosonogram are now becoming easy. You can take one volume, and the machine like Sonoscape can give you the entire all the sections in one go. And even otherwise, if you're doing a routine scan, the amount of time which we normally spend in a biparietal diameter, labeling the things, measuring the things, is very often quite a bit. So it might be as much as 40 seconds or sometimes even up to a 1 minute when you label a particular section like a VPD section. When you do all the measurement, this is now all done manually, and you can finish almost like important sections like the biparietal diameter or the transventricular view in less than 3 seconds. So that's a big advantage. So we are already in the era of artificial intelligence. It is there to stay, and I'm very happy to see that companies like Sonoscape are taking a lead as far as this is concerned. So let's come to the basic thing, ventriculomegaly. So first of all, how do we measure the lateral ventricles? So until you see the parieto-occipital sulcus, we measure the lateral ventricles at the level of the glomus of the choroid plexus. So here we have to be perpendicular to the ventricles, and we, as we said, measure at the level of the glomus of the parietal choroid plexus, and we measure from inner to inner side. But once we start seeing the parieto-occipital sulcus, which as we know typically happens by 18 weeks or 20 weeks, or by the time you do an anomaly scan, we measure the lateral ventricle at the level of the parieto-occipital sulcus. And this is very important. Now, basically, we have to remember that just like an NT scan, where we had strict guidelines on how to measure the NT, similarly, when you measure the lateral ventricles, we need to follow some guidelines. The head has to be an axial plane, obviously. We have to magnify the image appropriately so that the head fills up the majority of the image. The focal zone should be at an appropriate level. The ventricles should be symmetrical in appearance. The midline fox should be well seen. The atrium on the occipital horn of the lateral ventricle should be very clearly seen. There should be no artifact. And we measure the atrium of the lateral ventricle with the calipers placed on the inner wall and the lateral wall of the ventricle. So this is how ventricles are to be measured. This is very important. This might sound very basic, but it is important because every day or every week we have reports of mild ventriculomegaly. When they come to us for a review, we find that the ventricles are normal. So very often the errors come up because of wrong technique and wrong measurements. So very often people ask, since we are shifting from second trimester to first trimester, how do you measure the lateral ventricles in first trimester? There are no definite guidelines. People have come out with various measurements, like for example, looking at the choroid plexus length, choroid plexus area, choroid plexus diameter, and then comparing with the lateral ventricle. And there are some cutoffs for normal, there are some cutoffs for ventriculomegaly, but as of today, these are not standardized. One of the problems which comes up in a day-to-day practice when we take our basic views is that the anterior lateral ventricle is not well seen, and this is because of the near field artifact. Now, the argument in favor of the anteposterior lateral ventricle is that that very often ventricular problems are bilateral, and therefore, if something is wrong in the posterior horn, you would make special effects to look at the anterior. But that's not a very good argument. And I would say that we should try and make an attempt to look at the anterior ventricle by taking a slightly oblique axial view or maybe a coronal view. And in fact, in our center, Jyoti is very fond of this section where she goes a little oblique and makes sure that she has visualized both the lateral ventricles. I think that's a very good habit because you can miss near field ventricular problems, and later on we'll talk of asymmetrical ventriculomegaly or asymmetrical problems. That time, this view is very, very important. The other problem which we have seen in day-to-day practice is wrong measurements on long labeling of ventricles. This looks very fundamental, but very often we have seen reports coming from sometimes junior doctors where they may look at a midline fox and then look at this white line, which is nothing but an artifact, and they measure this distance. This is not ventricle. This line actually is basically a line which comes from the Sylvian fissure, where the vessels sort of curve and make a sharp angulation, and therefore there is sort of an interface, very sharp interface, and this gives rise to the white line, and this is not the ventricle. This is very okay. So once we have looked at the ventricle, you have measured it in the right way, and then you come to a measurement, and you want to know whether it is normal or abnormal. So typically we know that normal ventricles range between 5 to 8 millimeters in day-to-day practice, but anything which is above 10 is definitely above 2.5 or 4 standard deviation, and therefore for all practical purposes, 10 millimeters is a magic figure, right from second trimester or even in the third trimester. And if anything is more than 10 millimeters, we call it as ventriculomegaly. Now, there are various ways of categorizing ventriculomegaly. This is what we follow, and this is what I feel should be done because it helps us in prognostication. Mild is when it goes between 10 and 12, moderate when it goes between 13 and 15, and severe when it goes above 15. There are some people who do not like this system, but I feel this is very good in day-to-day practice, especially in counseling the patients and in the follow-up. Now, very often the question asked is what happens when you have 9.5, 9.7? Well, if you have anything between 10 and 12, as we'll see later on, the outcome is normal or it is as good as any other fetus. And therefore, anything which is 9.5 and 9.7 is going to be have the same sort of an outcome. But if I have something which is closer to 10, then I'm a little alert and I will definitely ask for a follow-up. I'll show you one or two cases where 9.5, 9.7 has crossed 10. So that has to be kept in mind. So at this time, I may not frighten the patient, but definitely I'll be just alert and would let's call it. But for all practical purposes, when you have something which is bordering around 10, less than 10, for all practical purposes, it is going to be normal except for few cases. So there are various ways of classifying ventriculomegaly. We can, depending upon severity, we said it is mild, moderate when it is between 13 and 15, and severe when it is above 15. Depending upon the evolution, how it goes, it can be classified as transient ventriculomegaly, stable ventriculomegaly, or progressive ventriculomegaly. We'll see some examples of that. Depending upon the laterality, it can be unilateral or bilateral. And depending upon associated findings, it can be isolated or complex. This is a very important sort of a subgroup. Once you have something complex, that means something else associated in the CNS system, it's a different ballgame. So this is another way of looking at ventriculomegaly. Then there are terms like asymmetrical ventriculomegaly and ventricular asymmetry and asymmetric ventriculomegaly. So we say that the ventricles are asymmetric if the difference between the two is 2 millimeters, and we use the term asymmetric ventriculomegaly when there is an asymmetry and one or both ventricles are more than 10 millimeters. Okay, so that's the difference. These are the different terms, and we'll see what is the significance of these sort of ventriculomegalies at the end of this talk. So these are just examples. Here we have a very mild ventriculomegaly, just about 11 millimeters. Here we have a moderate ventriculomegaly, about 14 millimeters. Here we have a severe ventriculomegaly going up to 17. And here we have an example of an asymmetrical ventriculomegaly, because one ventricle is dilated and there is an asymmetry between the two. Now, when we have ventriculomegalies which are severe, typically going above 15 millimeters, usually it can be a different ball game or a different group of entities. So here, for example, we have a severe ventriculomegaly. The septal leaflets are fenestrated, so much so that the choroid plexus from the upper ventricle has crossed the midline and has gone on the other side. So this is a very common thing to see. That's a severe ventriculomegaly. And when we see severe with thinning of the cortex, we tend to use the word hydrocephalus. So what is the difference between ventriculomegaly and hydrocephalus? The ventriculomegaly is a general term for anything. Whenever the ventricles are dilated, we just call it ventriculomegaly. Whereas hydrocephalus actually, in theory, means that there is an increased pressure in the ventricles. But in a fetus, we cannot measure the pressures in the ventricle, right? So if there is some evidence of either an abnormal accumulation of CSF or there is some evidence of an obstruction to the CSF, like for example in aqueduct stenosis, we use the word hydrocephalus. So typically when you have gross ventriculomegaly, most of the times we are dealing with hydrocephalus and not plain ventricular. The hydrocephalus itself is of two types. One is a non-communicating time where there is a definite obstruction, for example, aqueduct stenosis, or a communicating time when the ventricular system as such doesn't have an obstruction, but you have some basal problems like basal adhesions because of hemorrhage, because of infection. And this is more commonly, I would say, seen in neonates or children, whereas in the fetus, very often we see obstructive hydrocephalus. And the other reason which we group of ventriculomegalies are because of a post insult, which are basically ex vacuo ventriculomegaly. That is, something has gone outside, and that's why the ventricles are dilated. So that's another way of looking at fetal ventriculomegaly. So very often, as I said, when you have gross ventriculomegaly and we suspect that there is a CNS flow problem, we use the term hydrocephalus because the most likely cause of this is a hydrocephalus. And hydrocephalus, as I said, we need to look at pressures which we are not able to do in a fetal life. And the most common causes of hydrocephalus are many annual-Chiari-2 malformation, secondary to minor open neural tube defect, aqueduct stenosis, Dandy-Walker malformation, arachnoid ulcers, tumors, and hemorrhage. And usually the diagnosis is very obvious. So we will cover this section, but our focus will be today. So as I said, almost 90% or close to 9% are because of annual-Chiari-2 malformation, which is secondary to an open neural tube defect, and the major chunk is aqueduct. So here's a classical example of annual-Chiari-2. We have an open spinal defect, we have a hydromelia here, we have a kyphosis, here gross spinal kyphoscoliotic deformity, the ventricles are grossly dilated, and the cause here obviously is secondary to us open NTD or annual-Chiari-2 malformation. This is a classical aqueduct stenosis. Why? Because we have typically what is known as a triventricular dilatation. So we have dilatation of both the lateral ventricles and we have dilatation of the third ventricle, and the fourth ventricle is normal. That means something is wrong between the third and the fourth, and as we know that aqueduct is what we see. So aqueductal stenosis is another common cause of obstructive hydrocephalus. It is with an incidence of about 1.1 to 5,000. This is very important that very often they are associated with X-linked recessive inheritance. And therefore, if there is a history of a male child in the family having an aqueductal stenosis and the patient comes to you for scanning, beware of this problem because it can recur and it's an X-linked recessive disorder. Or if you have a male fetus, we need to evaluate for this gene, which we'll talk about subsequently. So here the catch is, or the diagnostic point is that we have hydrocephalus, but the posterior fossa is normal. You don't see a cyst in the posterior fossa simply because the problem is at the level of aqueduct and the fourth ventricle does not dilate. So that's the clue towards diagnosis. And very often when we see this feti or when you follow up them, there's a progressive thinning of the cortex and we have a secondary macrocephaly also. So we were talking about the genes. So typically, as I said, we have an aqueductal stenosis can be an X-linked inheritance, and they have isolated a gene which is L1CM gene. Now, this particular gene, like our famous coronavirus, has a lot of mutations, and depending upon the mutations, we have a large spectrum of X-linked hydrocephalus and what is known as an L1 spectrum. So there are various things which you can get: mental retardation, shuffling gaits, adapted thumbs, etc. Let us not go into that because it's more of a genetic problem, more of a problem which neonatologists see. As far as we are concerned, if you think of an aqueductal stenosis, and especially in a male fetus, we need to look at this genetic problem. Aqueductal stenosis can not only be because of aqueductal obstruction, it can also be because of secondary obstruction to the aqueduct because of fibrosis, secondary to say fetal infections like CMV, toxo, or intracranial bleeding. And in some cases, we do not know the cause of aqueductal stenosis. This group is also a very, very major chunk. So another example of aqueductal stenosis, usually the diagnosis is straightforward. You have cross ventriculomegaly, you have thin parenchyma. Initially, people used to take ventricular hemisphere ratio. They used to measure the cerebral cortex, but I don't think that is very, very useful. Usually, if it is very gross, the prognosis is not good. People have done intrapartal shunts, which have not had a favorable outcome. A good number of these feta require shunt after birth. That's a classical example of aqueductal stenosis. Cross hydrocephalus, posterior fossa normal, and this child they had put a shunt, and subsequently did not do well. So as I said, we are going to focus more on not this sort of hydrocephalus, but more on mild to moderate, which we see more often in practice, and we have a dilemma of what to do. So the prevalence of this could be in the range of 0.3 to 1.5 in general. But remember that ventriculomegaly is just a whistleblower. It tells us that something is wrong and we need to now investigate further. That's very important to understand. That if we have picked up something, some clue, it's a whistleblower. Now look at the fetus in more details and investigate according to it. This is what we are going to do. So after you have diagnosed a ventriculomegaly, what are you going to do? The first step we need to do is do a detailed CNS examination. So we'll see how we do the detailed CNS examination. It has to be step-by-step approach. Then we need to look at the fetus in general, and we need to look at specific things like looking at heart, looking at fetal infection signs, signs of chromosomal agglomeration, any signs of syndromic association. And depending upon these findings, we will fine-tune our lab investigations. MRI definitely plays an important role, and we will talk about it. And then we need to follow up the patient and counsel them accordingly. But we need to be very clear in our mind how we are going to counsel the patient. And this is going to be the focus of the talk. So we said that one way of looking at ventriculomegaly is whether it is simple, isolated, or whether it is complex. And when we say complex, that means are there CNS malformations or no, which are associated. So as you can see that as the degree of ventriculomegaly goes on increasing, the chances of associated CNS anomalies are more. As the degree of ventriculomegaly goes on increasing, the chances of infections are also more. So the first thing we need to do is to do a detailed CNS exam. But again, when we do this, we have to be very clear in mind what we are going to do, and we have to do it in a step-by-step manner. And there is a chart which has been suggested by none other than Timor Krish, but which I have modified to help us in day-to-day practice. So the first thing we need to do when you have a ventriculomegaly is look at posterior fossa. Because in the posterior fossa, you have three important clues. One is open neural tube defect, which we talked about. We'll talk about it again. Dandy Walker malformations and spectrum, and of course something like cerebellar hypoplasia. Ventriculomegaly, look at the posterior fossa. You will have clues there. As I said, in for aqueductal stenosis, if the posterior fossa is normal, you have dilated lateral ventricles and third ventricles, you look at stenosis. So posterior fossa, when we evaluate, we need to take the axial plane and we need to take the sagittal plane for the vermis and the brainstem, and of course for the tentorium to look. So in the posterior fossa may be obliterated with the famous banana sign with ventriculomegaly. That's a clue towards diagnosis of annual TRE, which is an open neural, this is secondary to an open neural tube defect, loss of spinal fluid, loss of intercranial pressure, with posterior structures sort of herniating into the upper cervical spine. And that is how it comes out. But that's a clue. And very often we pick up annual TRE2 with obliteration of posterior fossa, and that leads us to the spine, as all of us know. So ventriculomegaly, posterior fossa effacement, look at you will pick up an entity. Sometimes the defect itself is very small. Here, for example, we have an encephalocele, but we have a gross ventriculomegaly and effacement of the posterior fossa. Okay. The second clue in the posterior fossa for a ventriculomegaly could come when you see a large cystic lesion in the posterior fossa. For example, something like a Dandy-Walker malformation. And when you suspect this, the next thing which you do, sagittal view. Because from sagittal view, looking at the size of the vermis, looking at the brainstem vermis angle and the brainstem temporal angle, we will differentiate between vermi and hypoplasia, as in this case. Here, this is a case where the ventricles were not above 10 millimeters, but there is there's a good vermi and hypoplasia, and therefore in this case, this measurement of 9.7, 9.8 will become significant. But if everything is normal, then as we said, here we have a Dandy-Walker malformation, again with ventriculomegaly, vermis very small, and the brainstem tentorium angle going to almost about 70 degrees or so. Here we have a fetus with ventriculomegaly, almost about 14 millimeters, and we see that the cerebellum is extremely small. We are not seeing the structures in the midline, and that is Stephanus relapsing. So this is how the posterior fossa gives us clue about us for ventriculomegaly. If you have in the posterior fossa fourth ventricle also dilated, and there is some evidence of an infection or hemorrhage, then you could think of a communicating hypothesis also. Okay. Now, if the posterior fossa is normal and you have ventriculomegaly, your next focus should be on the cavum septum pellucidum and the corpus callosum. So, as I said in the beginning, cavum septum pellucidum is a standard section in all our fetal scans, and so is this midline sagittal section. Whatever gestational age you are looking at a fetus, always make it a habit. Just like we take 4-chamber with color and 3VT in color in almost all feti, we always look at the sagittal section of the brain, and you have come to a diagnosis. So another example again of ventriculomegaly with corpus callosum dysgenesis. So this is not a lecture on corpus callosum, but basically this is a very, very important all gestations. And if the cavum septum pellucidum is absent, you could land up with a diagnosis of cephaly, which is again very often associated with, think of septo-optic dysplasias, where again there is communication between the neurons, and you could have a septo-optic dysplasia. And of course, if the corpus callosum is not seen, if the cavum septum is not seen, we are alert towards the diagnosis of corpus callosomergenesis or dysgenesis. So we always make it a point to look at corpus callosum. And this is a pregnancy around, I think, 20-21 weeks. We have the famous racing car sign in an axial plane. Then we have colpocephaly in an axial plane. The corpus callosum is not visualized in the midline. The vermis is seen very well, and the pericallosal artery has. So look out for corpus callosum. Here, typically, you have frontal horn separating out. Corpus callosum again not seen, and abnormal. Another example again, ventriculomegaly, colpocephaly. We have complete agenesis of corpus callosum, and we have posterior fossa abnormality as well. So this is again ventriculomegaly, just about 10. We have corpus callosal dysgenesis, very thin corpus callosum, and we have an associated vermin. So ventricle is dilated. You looked at posterior fossa, you looked at cavum septum pellucidum, you looked at midline, and you have come to a diagnosis. So another example again of ventriculomegaly with corpus callosum dysgenesis. So this is not a lecture on corpus callosum, but basically This is a very, very important structure to look at whenever there is no. And the reason is that corpus callosum abnormalities are seen in almost 13 to 15% of feti who are referred for ventricular mortality. And in this group, corpus callosum dysgenesis is isolated in almost 25%, whereas in the remainder group, its complications with either karyotype abnormalities or other CNS abnormalities which were seen during the fetus or after the fetus was born or in the childhood. Okay. So looking at corpus callosum, if there is a fetus ventricular is very, very important. And we'll discuss a case later on in the talk. Okay. So now you have done two things. One, you have done the posterior fossa and you have looked at the cavum septum pellucidum and the corpus callosum. If all this looks normal, then now you look at two more things. One is look at signs of any insult which has happened to the fetus and look at any chances, anything which is a clue towards cortical malformation and migrational disorders. So the first thing is there any insult? Insults like infection, hemorrhage, ischemic sort of an incidence, any destructive lesions, or something like a tumor. Okay, so infections can cause approximately almost 5 to 10% of mild to moderate ventricular are because of infections like CMV, toxo, or Zika. Infections give rise to ventriculomegaly in four ways. One is an ex vacuo, as we said, because of cerebral atrophy. Second is aqueductal stenosis because of ependymal fibrosis. Third is a communicating hydrocephalus because of the inflammation of arachnoidal granulation tissue. As I said, in communicating hydrocephalus, the fourth ventricle is normal, but there is a problem at the base. Or infection can give rise to hydrocephalus because of excessive production of TSF. So there are four ways in which infection can give rise to ventriculomegaly. So it's a very major chunk of of the causes of ventriculomegaly. And the chances of infection again depend, as we said earlier, on the size of the ventriculomegaly. In a more severe ventriculomegaly, the chances of infection are more. Now, very often the signs of fetal infection on ultrasound can be very subtle and you need to be very alert. Here, for example, we have a ventricle of 14 millimeters and all we see is just thickening of the ventricular walls. Another example, again, ventriculomegaly, thickening of the ventricular walls and of course, fluid in the nuchal fold. Here we have ventriculomegaly, but we have gross findings like periventricular calcification and basal ganglia. Another example, again with gross calcifications intracranial, periventricular calcification, basal. Another example of a rubella with periventricular calcification and a cataract changes in the lens. So when we see intracranial calcifications, we have to be alert for fetal infections. But remember that there is an entity known as pseudotorch. And in fact, I had a very nice case, but because of this lack of access to the computers, I was not able to get it, where there is no evidence of infection, but again, it is supposed to be it's supposed to be a recessive disorder where there is no evidence of infection, but you see intracranial calcification, which is commonly known as a pseudotorch, and a gene for this has been isolated. Then, of course, the other cause, sort of an insult can be in the form of an hemorrhage. Hemorrhage, as we know that there are grades of hemorrhage, 4 grades of general matrix hemorrhage, that is where hemorrhage very often starts. Very often, you may not see ventriculomegaly in the beginning. Here, for example, you have gross ventricular, you don't have ventriculomegaly, but there is a gross shift of the midline. But sooner or later, intracranial hemorrhage will give us to ventriculomegaly because of obstruction, if not at that level, maybe even at the base, giving rise to hydrocephalus. So that is another sort of an insult. The third insult is, of course, in the form of tumors. Any tumor inside the brain can cause. Now, insults can leave behind their sequelae, and you could actually pick up a ventriculomegaly, and then you look at the sequelae of a particular insult because you are not there at the time of the insult. Most of the times they happen in early second trimester, and you see the sequelae. The sequelae could be in the form of ventriculomegaly with poranquitis, The sequelae of an insult would be in the form of corpus callosal dysgenesis, which you pick up later, and associated periventricular cysts. Now, there are some cystic lesions of the brain which at first glance look like ventriculomegaly, but they are not ventricular. Typically, for example, some large porencephalic cysts, large arachnoidal cysts, for example, hydranencephaly, and for example, schizencephaly. So this is not a true ventriculomegaly. This is a destructive disorder of the brain where there has been an insult in the early vascular insult, typically coming up early in the fetal life, and all you see is multiple scattered cystic areas. Schizencephaly again, at first glance, because you see a lot of fluid everywhere, you could call it mistakenly as a ventriculomegaly. You could have associated ventriculomegaly as in this case, but that's a typical open lip schizencephaly. So you have done this and you have had no clues so far, then you specifically look out for malformations of cortical development and migrational disorders, things like lysencephaly, heterotopia, megalencephaly. So this was a paper presented by I think in Vienna, and what she said is that whenever there is ventriculomegaly and you're looking out for signs of migration disorders, always look at the walls of the ventricles. If the walls of the ventricles show such irregularities, then you should be alert towards diagnosis of migrations. And we had one such case, where ventricles of about 13-14 millimeters. And if you look at the walls of the ventricle, they're quite irregular. And that can be a clue towards possibility of a migration disorder. So all these things are very, very important. Then we can have megalencephaly, where you have head, and typically you have a large subarachnoid space. And this case is, of course, given to me by Dr. Suez some years back. But we had this case of a hemimegalencephaly, where we had asymmetrical ventriculomegaly. We had a large head, and typically on one side with a large subarachnoid space. So that's a hemimegalencephaly. So now you have gone step by step. You have looked out for signs of cortical malformation. You have looked for the walls of the ventricle, anything adjacent to the ventricle, etc. And everything looks normal. So you start thinking of a truly isolated ventriculomegaly. But before you label it as a ventriculomegaly, look at two more things. Look at the size of the skull, whether it is large or small. If the size of the skull is large, you could be dealing with a macrocephaly, and this can be associated with mild ventriculomegaly. Or if the size of the skull is small, you could be dealing with microcephaly. So here's an example of a ventriculomegaly with microcephaly with abdominal slant in the forehead. This turned out to be a chromosomal abnormality. Other condition where you get a similar thing, that means you have ventriculomegaly, you have microcephaly, you have periventricular calcification. This was because of an infection. So very often you see microcephaly, but when you look within the brain, you see dilated ventricles, and that's a clue towards further evaluation. So overall, as we said, that CNS anomalies are very common and we need to look at them. And as the degree of ventriculomegaly increases, the chances of a CNS anomalies increase. So overall, we now also need to look at the rest of the fetus. Overall, the chances of a CNS and non-CNS anomalies in a fetus with mild and moderate ventriculomegaly could go anywhere between 10 to 75%. In practice, most of the time, we are in the range of 50% or less than 50%. So now we need to look at the fetus, rest of the fetus in detail. For example, look at here, for example, we have a ventriculomegaly of 16 millimeters, and there is a cardiac anomaly in the form of a severe pulmonary valve stenosis. Here we have a ventriculomegaly, we have corpus callosal dysgenesis, and we have a corrected TGA, which is a very rare combination, but this is what we had in this fetus. Look out for markers of chromosomal abnormality. We are all chromosomal abnormality, besides ventriculomegaly, single umbilical artery, ventricular cardiac anomalies, short femur, etc., etc. Here, for example, we had ventriculomegaly with limb anomalies. We can have ventriculomegaly associated with a diaphragmatic hernia. Once you have looked at features of chromosomal abnormality, look out specifically for any signs of infection in the rest of the fetus. This can be in the form of thick placenta. It can be in the form of pleural effusion, ascites, subcutaneous edema, calcifications in the liver, spleen, etc. But remember, one of the problem is that very often these things come up late and ventriculomegaly comes up early. So this has to be kept in mind. Infections, typically you could have early growth restrictions, calcifications, echogenic bowels, organomegaly, meconium peritonitis, polyhydramnios, microcephaly as we saw. But remember that these features can come later in the gestation. So when we counsel, this is one more thing we need to tell them. Look out for some markers of syndromic anomalies. For example, Walker-Weber syndrome, Bardet-Biedl, Neckel-Gruber, Jubars, hydronephus syndrome. Here, for example, we have a classical Neckel-Gruber, encephalocele, polydactyly, and kidneys which are cystic and enlarged. Here we have a Pinashoka, ventriculomegaly, akinesia, limbs were not moving at all, extended neck, and we had microglythia and retroglythia. We have Goldstone syndrome, where we have ventriculomegaly with a posterior fossa abdominality, typically in the form of a Dandy Walker, and you have cystic, dysplastic kidneys which are cystic with dysplastic kidneys. So that's a Goldstone syndrome. So look out for such syndromes, because if you can clinch a good diagnosis, it is helpful not only for this, for the parents, especially for the future, and for genetic consequences. Okay. So now what we have done so far is picked up ventriculomegaly, looked at the brain in details, looked at the fetus in details, and now we have come to some sort of a conclusion what we are dealing with. So we now need to do lab investigations. Lab investigations will get swayed by your ultrasound findings, but suppose you truly have a borderline mild or moderate ventriculomegaly with no other clues, then we definitely need to investigate further. For all practical purposes, as of today, instead of doing a karyotyping, it is better to do a CGH microarray, because you might get more, you will pick up more things in almost 10 to 15% of the cases. Why is a torch PCR? Now, what happens here is very often we do an amniocentesis, but very often it is done a little early. We might do it at 18 weeks, and sometimes, depending upon when the infection has come up, torch PCR may come positive later. So we can just counsel the patient about this. And of course, if you think of intercalated hemorrhage, then you might evaluate from that point of view. This is a very old case, but I kept it because one of my students just picked up this 11 millimeters ventricles, everything normal, many years back, and we did a karyotype, and there was an abnormality in 21 chromosomes. So it's very important that even if you have a mild ventriculomegaly, evaluation is very, very important. So as I said, then microarray can pick up more abnormalities, and therefore, as of today, this would be a preferred investigation. But it all depends on what we see. If you see aqueductal stenosis and if you think of an X-linked recessive disorder, you will look out for this gene specifically as such. So of course the investigations are tailor-made depending upon their findings, but these are the microarrays is a must. And at least since we remove the fluid and torch PCR is not very costly, if the mother has done has done a torch test, we can always look at it. But this is a good test because it is not very costly. Here, of course, we had a CMV infection, but the problem here is that usually it takes time for the torch PCR to be positive in amniotic fluid. So very often when you do it before 21 weeks, the sensitivity is low. If you do it after 21 weeks, the sensitivity is higher. So we need to counsel the patients about this particular test. MRI, yes, again, it does give us useful information, especially when you are talking of cortical malformations, migration abnormalities. Sometimes in fetal infections also we get good clues. But additional important investigation, which is useful to us as such, is seen in only about 1 to 14% of the cases. Again, with MRI, the problem is that we get better results after 22 or 24 weeks of gestation. So this again has to be considered. And as Dr. none other than Gustav Mallinger says, that a very good ultrasound is much better than an MR which is not done adequately or rightly done. So this has to be kept in mind. If you do a good ultrasound, especially if the head is down, you do a transvaginal ultrasound, probably your information is going to be better than MRI because your resolution is much superior. But MRI is definitely useful because we can counsel the patient, because most of the patients in our practice are now affording. So if you tell them, okay, MRI is going to be useful at this stage or a later stage, they will go for it. So these are just examples of interventricular hemorrhage, torch infections, and of course, periventricular decompression. How do we follow up? Follow up is very, very important, as we said. If you're dealing with a ventriculomegaly, which is 10 to 12, the chances of normalization are good. If you're dealing with something like 13 to 15, the chances reduce, but still there are some chances. But ventriculomegaly can stabilize in about 50 to 75%, and they can progress to severe ventriculomegaly in almost 16% of the cases. So this is very, very important when we counsel the patient. So progression can happen in almost 16% of the cases, and this can change the diagnosis and prognosis. So this is a very important point when we counsel the patients and ask for follow-up. If, on the other hand, ventriculomegaly stabilizes or it resolves, the prognosis can. And this is an example which I said I will talk about. This was a case referred to us by one radiologist, actually very nicely picked up borderline ventriculomegaly, which was just about 12 millimeters, and he was not happy with the cavum septum pellucidum. And he was right. The cavum septum pellucidum was not good at that time. I was not, though she was only 18 weeks, whatever corpus callosum I was seeing, I was not happy. So we counseled the patient of an evolving anomaly. We said we will do, and the patient, this is a very precious pregnancy. The patient said, okay, I want to continue whatever happens. But so we did a amniocentesis with the microarray, which was normal, everything normal. So we said, okay, we'll follow it up because sometimes, we don't know how things go. And at now she's 22 weeks or so, and her ventricle size have come back to normal, almost 8 millimeters. The corpus callosal length and the width is still below the standard deviation, so we have still labeled it as a dysgenesis. We have told the patient about all possible consequences. She has also gone to a pediatric neurologist, and it is her decision to continue. And God willing, everything should be good for her. But this is one example of how within a short time, the ventricle actually, the corpus callosum also has developed fairly well, though it is not optimum. In the short time, the ventricle has actually come back to almost 8 millimeters or so. So at least I'm hopefully positive. So when we counsel them, all these things have to be kept in mind. And in the back of our mind, we should know what is the prognosis going to be. Prognosis, as we said, depends largely on what CNS, non-CNS findings you see. It depends on what lab reports have shown. If you have something abnormal there, things are different. It depends on the association of other anomalies which are not detected at first. We'll come to this important point. Prognosis depends upon the progression of ventriculomegaly, and if it is truly isolated, then prognosis depends upon whether it's mild, moderate, or severe, and this we'll discuss in detail. The point is, when you have seen the patient, when you are counseling the patient first time, are you sure that it is truly an isolated ventriculomegaly? We cannot be sure because we now have evidence over a period of years, many years in fact, that almost 13% of feti where we thought it is isolated ventricularly have shown something or the other later on. That means our first examination has been false negative. And almost about 10% of feti, or 7 to 10% of feti, may show something else in the form of structural abnormalities after birth also. So this is a very nice chart which I found in reference. There are 2 or 3 common references you must have seen. One was from Nathan, which is a very nice reference, and this is another nice reference. So in the second trimester, if you have made an initial diagnosis and you repeat ultrasound in the third trimester, in almost 13% you might pick up something else. If you have done a second trimester ultrasound and you do a second trimester MRI, in roughly about anywhere between 5% or 50%, you might pick up something else. If your ultrasound is good, you will not pick up more in MRI. If you have done a second trimester ultrasound and a third trimester imaging, there is going to be a mild increase in this first. And if you have done a fetal MRI to begin with, and you do a postnatal MRI, again you might pick up something. So this is a very important point in counseling. So today, this looks like an isolated ventricular. I do not see anything else, but in tomorrow we need to see what it is. But let us talk of a truly isolated ventricular mechanism. That means you have done all investigations, you have done a thorough search for the fetus, and you feel that okay, there's nothing else I can find, and it is truly isolated. How do we prove it? How do we counsel the patient? So, as we said in the outset, it all depends upon what we have seen and what you have investigated, what your investigations show. But if the ventricular mechanism is really progressive and it is rapidly becoming severe or more, then we need to just make them alert about counseling with a pediatric neurosurgeon in case the fetus requires a shunt. But in practice, and even in our own experience, when we deal with isolated mild or moderate megaly, they do not progress to an extent of requiring a shunt. This happens typically when there is a progressive obstruction. For example, even acute rectal stenosis can be progressive. A ventricular megaly which is moderate at this stage or a little above 15 millimeters can progress over a period of time when you look at it in the But for all practical purposes, when we talk of mild to moderate ventricular megalies, that is between 10 and 15, the chances that they will develop to such an extent as to require a shunt are very, very less. So when we have a severe isolated ventricular megaly, the chances of survival are about 80%. Of those which survive, 40% could have neurodevelopmental could be neurodevelopmentally normal, but 60% could have neurodevelopmental delay. And overall survival without disability is in the range of 30 to 40%, and additional abnormalities may be seen in 10%. So this is how you counsel when you have an isolated severe ventricular megaly. If you have an isolated mild ventricular megaly, then we know that the survival is very high to the tune of 93 to 98%. And the likelihood of a normal neurodevelopmental outcome is more than 90%, which is as good as the general population. So when you have a lady who has got mild ventriculomegaly, you have ruled out everything else, then when you counsel them, you can tell them that the outcome is likely to be favorable and the infant is likely to be normal, because that's what evidence tells. If you have moderate ventriculomegaly, that means between 13 and 15, then there are more chances of an adverse outcome. The survival is still going to be very good, but the chances of a normal neurodevelopment is going to drop down from 90% to 75 to 90%. So when you counsel a lady who has got a moderate ventricular megaly between 13 and 15, we should tell them that the chances of a favorable outcome are still very high, but there is an increased risk of neurodevelopmental disabilities. So these figures help us in counseling the patient. And this shows us that in feti with isolated ventricular megaly, we need to follow up the babies after birth, looking out for specific things at 6 months, at 1 month, and 6 months to find out if there is a neurodevelopmental delay. There are some questions which are frequently asked. One of the common thing is what is the significance of unilateral ventricular megaly? That means one ventricle is dilated and the other is normal. Now we have a lot of articles about unilateral ventricular megaly, but the summary is that the incidence of neurodevelopmental delay in cases of both apparently mild and truly isolated ventricular megaly with an atrial width of less than 50 meters is likely to be similar to that reported in cases of isolated bilateral ventricular megaly and close to that reported in the general population. And therefore, when you have a unilateral ventricular megaly, for all practical purposes, the prognosis and the outcome is just like bilateral ventricular megaly, depending upon the size of the ventricle. What about asymmetric ventricular megaly? That means there is an asymmetry in the size with one or both ventricles dilated. Again, the evidence shows that somehow or the other, symmetric ventricular megaly are more associated with CNS problems than asymmetrical ventricular megaly. But this is true only for mild and moderate ventricular and for other but for severe ventricular the the chances of a CNS abnormality are almost equal. So there are other studies which have shown that the chances of a neurodevelopmental problems are more in a symmetrical ventricular than in a symmetrical ventricular. So these are things which probably we have not understood still very well. There are a lot of articles you can refer to, but we have to be a little skeptical when we talk about this. Does the sex of the fetus matter? Well, we know that ventriculomegalies are more common in males with a sex ratio of 1:7 and 1.7. This is, of course, because the incidence of active stenosis, X-linked active stenosis is high. But as far as the management and the outcome is concerned, it is identical in both. Thus, the timing and mode of delivery, should it differ? The timing and mode of delivery should be based on standard obstetric. Now, earlier in our practice, when we started doing ultrasound, we used to see this gross hydrocephalus, and sometimes we have tapped them to make delivery easy. Sometimes we have put intra partal shunts from the ventricles to the amniotic fluid. But all this is doesn't help at all. Okay, so in a very severe ventricular the prognosis is bad, and the delivery decision, of course, has to be done by the obstetrician based on whatever is standard. Is there a risk of recurrence? If the recurrence risk of an isolated ventricular in future is low, but depends on the cause. If there's a chromosomal problem, if there's something like a genetic abnormality, like as we say, like an X-linked recessive disorder, then of course the chances of recurrence will change depending on the finding. So all in all, ventriculomegaly is just a finding. As I said, the ventriculomegaly acts like a whistleblower, and what we need to do is come to a diagnosis in a very systematic manner. As we said, look at the brain first, look at the rest of the fetus, and then do the investigations in a tailored manner. And of course, counseling is very important. And I gave you some hints on how to counsel the patient. So thank you so much for your patient listening. And what I will do is, Gaurav, and try and
Yes, sir.
escape
Thank
and
you
go to
so
the
much.
chat
Sir, you
box.
can just stop sharing your screen, and then there are a few questions which are waiting, sir.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so someone is asking how to differentiate between ventriculomegaly due to infection and hemorrhage. As both are very much similar in appearance. Yes, that's true. But we look out for signs of infection. As I said, typically walls of the ventricle, if they're thick, sometimes we might see calcifications, typically periventricular calcifications, or you might see parenchymal calcification in the gross case. You might see something like a cataract in rubella. So look out for this thing. And hemorrhage usually, of course, if it is very subtle, you may not see. But you if it's a very low grade hemorrhage, germinal matrix hemorrhage, you might see that area of hemorrhage. Or if it's a gross hemorrhage like a parenchymal hemorrhage, then you might pick it up as I showed you the So, and so by far and large, you could make this difference. At times, of course, once you're seeing a sequelae, whether it has been because of infection hemorrhage can be different. Can there be a combination of stenotic and communicating hydrocephalus? Yes, yes, definitely. Because in infection, the question is, can there be a combination of stenotic and communicating hydrocephalus due to infection? Yes. Typically, as we said, in infections, you can have acute stenosis coming up because of fibrosis. And in infection, you can also have basal adhesions coming up or granulation tissue coming at the base, and that can give rise to a communicating hydrocephalus. Gaurav, any more questions on it?
Yes, sir. On the
On page
second,
two? Page, okay.
yeah,
Sorry.
page two, there are a
Is
few
a
questions.
is a lateral ventricle diameter of 6 millimeters at 13.6 isolated without associated finding. So as we said, for 13.6 weeks, there are no definite criteria. What people have tried to do is look at the size of the choroid plexus and see its ratio in relation to the ventricle. So they have done a diameter of of the choroid plexus to lateral ventricle, area of the corpus callosum to lateral ventricle, etc. But there are no definite criteria for ventriculomegaly in the first trimester. We can always follow them up. normal NT, anomaly, NIPT, known risk, and that growth shows only while ventricularly. NGSL, are we justified in offering? Okay, I think if you have a mild ventricular megaly of 12 millimeters, I would not do an NIPT. I would definitely do an invasive test. So I think I would ask for a microarray rather than NIPT. I think is more for if you have something screen positive, everything else normal. That is or a borderline screen positive. That is where I would do an NIPT. For a when you see something abnormal on ultrasound, I would not do an NIPT. I would do a microarray. I think we should do an invasive test and also talk about doing an PCR. Tell them that PCR may be normal at this stage, but it is worth giving a try. And this is because the cost of doing PCR is low. If the ventricle measures between 9 and the rest of the brain appears normal, should we offer microarray genetic test? Definitely no, no, no. As I said, if it is less than 10, between 10 and 12 also the prognosis is good. So if it is definite, if it is less than 10, we would not offer any invasive test. If it is bordering around 9.7, 9.8, we just follow up, but definitely not do an invasive test at this stage. Keen experience difference between communicating and non-communicating habit. Okay. So when we say non-communicating, as the word says, that means the communication has been interrupted. So communication is between lateral ventricle, and the foramen of Monro going into the third ventricle, and then we have an aqueduct going from the third ventricle into the fourth ventricle. So if there is an obstruction somewhere, typically, for example, aqueduct obstruction, then we call it a non-communicating aqueduct. And communicating is when there is no obstruction in this. That means the fourth ventricle is also dilated. That means after the CSF, from where it gets absorbed from the fourth ventricle to the foramen of Magendie and Leschka, or at the base of the brain, there is some problem like granulation tissue or maybe hemorrhage or something of that sort, which is obstructing the further flow. And these are typically known as non-communicating arterioles. But in practice for fetus, we don't use these terms. In fetus, very often it is basically in the newborn that we use these terms after doing a thorough evaluation. Echogenic 21 weeks gestation, echogenic focus in ventricle, nuchal thickness 5.6. Should we suggest amniocentesis or karyotyping? This is nothing to do with my talk of ventricular megaly. But whenever you have multiple markers, we know that we look at a likelihood ratio, and then if the likelihood ratio is high, then we offer a karyotyping. So this is out of the context as far as today's talk is concerned. Any other this thing?
So I think these were the questions which were there.
Great. Yeah. Great.
Yes, sir. So thank you so much, sir. On behalf of Sonoscape, I thank you again for taking out time to share your experience and very nice presentation from your side, sir.
Yeah. Thank you, Gaurav, and thank you all of you for joining in late in the evening. I know that there are too many webinars, and today also there is an overlap of webinars. But I hope that my talk was useful to you and you made good use of your precious time. And
so there were close to around 900 audience who was there live, and they were saying not only from India but from abroad also. There are people who have joined actually.
As long as this has helped everyone, that's good. And I thank Sonoscape for the help in educative programs. And I thank all of you. All of you stay safe, and we hope to meet sometime somewhere. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, audience, for joining us. If you want to again want to see this webinar, you can go to Sonoscape India YouTube page, and you can see these webinars by tomorrow. And there are some other webinars also which are there. So
and if
thank you so much,
questions,
audience.
Gaurav, and they have not asked, they can always direct them to you or to me directly.
Yeah, if any questions are there, they can come to me, and then I can pass on to you, sir, and then we can send it back to them.
Sure. Okay. Thank you so much.
Fine, sir. Thank you so much.
Good night.